So good afternoon, and for those who, this is the first time in this room, my name is Rory Maguire, I'm the Managing Director of AIME. For those who, this is probably about the fifth or sixth time in this room, I apologise for becoming the wallpaper of the room and being here every time you pop in. So the topic I'm going to talk through, I'll just do a quick flash of AIME slides. I won't go through them in detail, but if anyone is interested in knowing more about AIME, I'm going to be available all tomorrow in that area. We've got a little mini lounge, and come and talk to me about AIME. So, now, Payment Service Directive, I apologise, it's an afternoon topic. You probably have wine at lunchtime. You're going to fall asleep. If you fall asleep, put your hand up and I'll shout. But it's a very dry subject. I mean, first of all, it's European legislation, and we all hate European legislation for various reasons. PSD, as its first iteration, came into the UK in 2009. It's a 2007 European formation of Payment Service Directive, and then it's 2009 implemented in the UK, so local implementation. It's currently being updated to PSD2, and this time last year, we're probably at virtually the same position in talking about it as we are this time this year. It is pretty boring because it's legislation. However, and it should have absolutely nothing to do with pre-rate services because it's a financial regulation. However, it does, and if taken the wrong way, it can be fairly destructive. So, Payment Service Directive 1, and the reason for it is if you're not a bank and you're not an electronic e-money licensee, but you are handling money and you're taking it particularly off consumers and passing it to merchants, you're acting as an intermediary between consumers and merchants, or even if you're doing business to business money handling, Payment Service Directive was actually set in place to bring all these parties who weren't banks, weren't e-money issuers or regulated parties, and bring them into a payment regulation that can then be implemented locally. So in the UK, it's the FSA at the time, that will look after the payment service providers. So it creates these new people called PSPs, or Payment Service Providers. Sort of a very good example of a party that becomes a PSP that wasn't previously a PSP. I don't know if anyone's seen these pop-up banknote machines, where essentially they're not attached to any particular bank, link machines. You put your bank card in, you get your money out, just as normal. The entities that operated those originally weren't regulated, so it could take more money than you actually approved, and it could dispense, take more off your card and dispense less, and there'd be difficulties in resolving that. So when bringing Payment Service Directive 1 in, what Europe did is they worked on a few exemptions to the regulations. So who is exempted? Because you can't really bring absolutely everybody in, because becoming a payment service provider is quite an expensive thing to do and quite an expensive thing to run. So if you're a charity collector, which essentially you're taking money off a consumer and passing it over to a charity, you shouldn't have to pay £50,000 for a licence to do so, particularly if you're working in an amateur way. So people that weren't captured inside PSD1 were things like store cards, where you can go and get an Argos credit card, an Argos store card, and you could buy stuff from Argos, but you couldn't go down the road to Marks and Spencer's and use the same card. So store cards, what's called a limited network, charity collections I mentioned, commercial agents, and quite a few others. And then in amongst that, they then said, telecom providers are providing sort of payment services because they're collecting money off their consumers and they're passing it over to a third party. So they looked at that and went, and what are telecom providers doing? They're providing ringtunes and wallpapers and logos, so the real old-fashioned stuff. Don't forget, this is 2007 that they started talking about it. They said, okay, telecom providers are really adding value because they're providing the network, they're often providing the handset, etc. So they're adding value to these things that people are buying from third parties. So we'll exempt them as long as they continue to add value. But the wording they use created quite a lot of ambiguity, and the thing with ambiguity is then you have different interpretations right across Europe. So the ambiguity is the added value statement. So the exemption wording, I won't flash onto the screen, but the exemption wording talked about adding value. The other part of the actual regulation is a thing called recitals, which is almost like a narrative that says this is what we're intending to do, and then when they actually get to the regulation, that's the legal bit. But going back to the recital and say what was the intent behind the legal bit often helps with resolving certain issues. So the ambiguity is around added value. They talked about content, but it didn't cover the situations that emerged since then, which is like money transfer situations. Where, doing a charitable donation, you're actually transferring money from the telecom provider through to the charitable donation without actually anything being delivered, apart from a thank you from the charity. So that's effectively money transfer, and it wasn't covered. And it's also created a situation where you are allowed to run these services that you're adding value to, but when a prepay user buys a non-telecoms goods, if they're sitting on their computer and buying web access or access to a service on their computer, and it's been charged to their telecom account, they're actually providing non-telecoms goods called off-handset charging, and without an e-money license held by the operators, there's a potential breach of e-money regulations. So, and a good example of acting as an intermediary, which was inside the exemption. They said, providing you're not acting just as an intermediary, acting as an intermediary is a good example. Google Play now have mobile charging to their accounts. So you can load it with a credit card, or you can charge your Google Play videos and games to your mobile account. That is acting as an intermediary. So in Italy, Google Play can't operate because the Italian financial people said that's in breach of PSD. In UK, they went, yeah, it's all right as long as it's low value. So there's different implementation across Europe. There was also doubt because when European law is interpreted into UK law, it gets rewritten, and the person who rewrites has to sort of cover all the wrinkles. There's a bit of a doubt as to whether aggregators and payment intermediaries, particularly the payment intermediaries running Pay for It, whether they're exempted, the payment is exempted, but whether they as individuals are exempted as well. And the FCA in the UK is currently looking at that, and they believe that payment intermediaries are actually acting as merchant acquirers. So AIME has got that discussion going on with them to say actually they're not. And then what happens across Europe is that anyone can set up as a telecom provider. It's very easy. Get a license, get a switch, and then act as payment intermediary and claim exemption. So there were a couple of attempts to set up payment provision under the guise of telecom provision. So what Europe then did, okay, rewriting PSD2, cover lots of new modern ways of making payments, particularly electronic payments. And while we're at it, let's take the telecoms exemption and narrow its scope to stop ambiguity and to stop people exploiting the potential ambiguity. And this is the actual paragraph which exempts a telecoms provider, so it's a fixed line telecoms provider and mobile network operators from Payment Services Directive. And I've highlighted the bits that are sort of the main areas of change. So they say payment transactions carried out by the provider of electronic communication network services, blah, 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 and for the purchase of digital content, whereas previously it didn't say that, as ancillary services to electronic communication services. That's a new piece of wording, blah, 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 until you get to the bottom bit, which says the transaction must not exceed €50 per transaction, and the combined value in a month is €200. And immediately, red flags went up. Digital content doesn't allow voice services, so anyone who's used to picking up a phone line and dialing a pre-rate number, that will disappear when this comes into effect. If you take that tight interpretation, digital content doesn't cover services, and a lot of what mobile users do at the moment is use services, not content. So again, a tight interpretation would mean that we would lose services, we would lose content. This line as ancillary services to electronic communication services causes confusion, because what is an ancillary service to an electronic communication service? So, so AIME sort of went into its drew the first battle lines with Europe to try and get this new wording changed to be something that wasn't potentially destructive. First thing we looked at is, will MNOs become payment service providers? Now, certainly they've got the money to pay for the license, but the actual billing mechanics of an MNO doesn't really allow a consumer to have their telephone bill and a money part in the same billing mechanic, whether it's an electronic bill or a printed bill. It's very difficult for an MNO to say, this is the money that you've spent, and this is the telecoms that you've consumed. It's very difficult for them to make that change. The other thing is when you start talking about money and you're talking about a mobile, a monthly user, at the moment, when you get your bill from your telecoms provider, it's a deferred charge. So if you made a call 3 weeks ago, the charge for that call has been deferred until they run the bill. If they start issuing money, it's actually a credit, so you need to have a credit arrangement with the consumer as well as the telecom arrangement. So it's really a confusing picture, and were the MNOs likely to go down that? Probably not. Finance Director will go, premium rate service is worth this much, cost of doing this is worth this much, and they're fairly blinkered financial directors. They don't look that far into the future, and they go, no, not worth it. Close down the department that runs this, potentially. The other issue is the digital content side. We were worried about that. The ancillary services, as I said before, the €200 per month limit. Again, telecom providers can't say, they can say you can run a bill up to this much, but they can't say you can run a bill for your third-party services up to that much. They haven't got the mechanics to do that distinction between overall billing and billing for just that element. So if they shut it all down, or they shut down those particular elements that were not exempted, approximately £250 million per annum will be wiped off the UK industry. Pretty serious. And if you then mirror that across the other 25 states of the EU, that's quite a big hit. So as AIME, we've coordinated with PhonePay Plus, because it's in PhonePay Plus's interest to maintain a regulatory environment around micropayments. The Mobile Broadband Group, which is the MNO's regulatory coordination body. So we've got together, AIME got together with those two entities, and we've then went into the Treasury. The Treasury is the one that's discussing the Payment Service Directive, and we detailed to the Treasury, which is quite difficult because the Treasury talk financial speak, and we talk telecom speak, and so although it's English, it's different English across the table. But eventually we got them to understand the market, current market, and the future potential of charge to mobile and voice-based premium. And we also got the support of Andrew Leadsom, who's the Economic Secretary. So having an MP supporting you and having a financial-based MP is quite useful. Treasury now has come on board with AIME, with the premium rate industry in the UK, and is going back with suggestions of how this wording can be changed to make sure that the current business and future business is protected. So the feedback, and this has gone on for a year, and it's getting very close to finalisation. So the feedback from EU is, first of all, UK is the only one that seems to be actually actively campaigning inside EU against the changes to the exemption. That feels like the situation. I talk to people in Germany, and their telecoms people and their financial people don't talk to each other. And it's the financial people that are sitting around the table discussing the PSD. Most of the member states outside of Germany and France are very supportive of the UK position and feel that it mirrors in their country. Germany and France want to completely remove the exemption, and some of the member states who are taken a bit of a caution, want to limit the per transaction charge and per monthly charge that's inside the current exemption. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. What we've done, because it's gone backwards and forwards for the last few weeks, is actually made an amendment to the recitals, because the recitals are used, as I said before, in the interpretation of the actual exemption. So what does the recital say about what the exemption is supposed to do? So we've made some amendments to the recitals, or proposed amendments, that we added voice in, we added digital services, we gave greater examples in the recitals of the sorts of products and services that we're aiming to keep inside or exempted from payment services. And we also added, there's a little bit of a wrinkle that because this is European legislation and they try to do everything right across Europe, because you can have a payment provider and the consumer in different countries, and so they need to normalise it. With telecom payments, the consumer and the telecom provider, even though the consumer may be roaming internationally, they're actually considered to be in the same country, and so therefore each country or each member state should be able to set its own limits. So you have a broad exemption, and then you have member state set limits. So that was something that was a little bit of a brainwave from AIME that we put into the iteration, and they're quite pleased with that. And then the actual clause, we amended clause 3L, say that the payment service is the ancillary part, not the service you're buying. We added the voice and digital services, and we added the member state can set limits. Now, the Italians, who have currently got the presidency, so they tend to get the biggest shout of all the countries, have added another clause called 3LA. I told you it'd be boring. And 3LA is they want to protect charitable donations, and they want to allow for tickets without actually explaining what tickets mean. But, however, they set a limit to €5. Now, a lot of the charities are going, this is ridiculous, because we're actually pushing the limits up to, 10, 20 pounds in the UK. €5 is ridiculous. I pointed out to the Treasury, if you actually allow an exemption for charitable donations but wipe off everything else, all the M&Os will go, we're closing the department, so charitable donations disappear anyhow. So you can have an exemption for a charitable donation that's never usable. What we have done is we've added to the ticket bit vouchers, because vouchers covers a massive amount of opportunities. You can buy a voucher for a car park, you can buy a voucher for a cup of coffee. It's a digital voucher. You can translate that voucher into a physical good, potentially. And also to, again, on 3LA, to have the limit set by each member state to a maximum of €50. So that's the work we're doing at the moment. It's now a waiting game. UK Treasury is out there in Brussels fighting on behalf of the UK industry, trying to also get support across the rest of the European states, and trying to convince France and Germany that by each member state setting its own value, if they wanted to take payment services away from telecom providers that are not licensed, then they can set those values to 0, and it won't affect anyone else in Europe. It just affects the German operators and the French operators, or if they want to set it at a low limit. What we do need, though, is the rest of the European industries to actually push for the same, essentially lobby, because it just does feel like AIME is battling on behalf of Europe, which is quite exhausting sometimes. So for those who are non-UK people here in the audience, and thank you for listening so far, is go back to your trade bodies, to your regulators, to your government, and say, we've got to sort out this exemption, because otherwise we will just see a decimation of the existing premium rate services and future potential across Europe if the rest of the European bodies don't fight for the same cause. That is a very
That's
quick...
it in a nutshell. Blimey. Excellent, thank you, Rory. James, on a more practical front, you have to deal with this every day. PSD1, we're back to now. What does it sort of mean on a sort of practical basis, trying to interpret this, or the way it's interpreted differently in different countries?
Yeah, no, so yes, my name is James Patmore. I'm the Managing Director of Boku in EMEA. So I joined Boku in 2009. Actually, we started Boku in 2009. And then we kind of, in the first kind of week, we looked at relevant legislation, of which we just raised $75 million from US VCs, so they tend to kind of make you go and look at laws and see what things might affect their investment. And so we looked at the Payment Services Directive, and then I started in January, and I think it was enacted in April timeframe, so I thought this was going to be a very short career at Boku when I read the legislation. I thought it was going to be a nice 4 months consultancy project, and then I'll go and get another job. But being kind of more serious, I guess what it brought home to us was that it's difficult to run a business under an exemption, or even run an industry under an exemption to a piece of European legislation. Particularly when you're kind of trying to kind of manage the interests of your investors who've invested all of this money into a business, and then you say it's a great business, but if you read this kind of 3-sentence paragraph in some European legislation, that's what we're basing the entire business plan on. But luckily, after 3 months, we did manage to carry on, and it wasn't the end of the world, and we managed to kind of grow the business. But what we found is that our strategy as a company was always to try and sign up companies who'd never used operator billing before. So we didn't ever want to compete with existing aggregators or existing businesses, because we felt that it would be good for the mobile operators to have incremental revenue, and also we didn't want to kind of get into a fight with everybody else in the industry. The trouble with that was that when we went to go and sign up companies like, the big kind of games consoles or music streaming services, these companies had lots of lawyers, like mobile operators, and also they tended to look at things in quite a high degree of detail. And what we found is that as we went to try and launch those services, in every country they looked at the Payment Services Directive, and then they also looked at the fact that it was differently interpreted, there's a different interpretation in every country. So our kind of time to market to get those services launched was kind of dramatically slowed down, because we had to sign an agreement for every country, and also we had to look at the legislation in every country. And in Poland it was interpreted differently to France, to Germany, to the UK. So for us, the main impact on our business of the PSD exemption has been a kind of a time to market issue in terms of getting, how quickly can we get services launched. Obviously, as Rory pointed out, there is also a more of a kind of a ticking time bomb aspect to it as well, which is, depending on how it's interpreted in certain countries, it could spell the end to what we do as well. So the other thing that we did as well from within the first kind of month was decide we'd go and get ourselves an e-money license, because we felt that being regulated as a financial institution would also, without really knowing what we might use that e-money license for, would actually safeguard our business, and obviously the $75 million our investors had put into the company. And it took us about 3 years to get an e-money license, to go through that process. And we had to all prove that we were fit and proper people and directors, and then we had to hire a load of people to go and deal with things like anti-money laundering, know your customer legislation, suspicious reporting activities. And because obviously if you are a regulated financial institution, you have to make sure you do it properly, otherwise you'll end up losing your license. So I guess it's a very long answer to your question, but I guess the main impact for us is really, in the last 5 years, has been time to market. Trying to get these services launched quickly, and also the fact you have different interpretation in different countries, which has meant that where we operate in 40 European Union countries, it's quite difficult for us to run a consistent business, because we don't know how mobile operators will view the business and how regulators will view the business, because when they took that European text and translated it into their own language, it turned into something slightly different.
And was it worth the wait? Was it worth the time it's taken to get to where you are now, the many years of getting an e-money license?
To be clear, we didn't stop. We carried on doing what we were doing, and we just pretended it didn't exist, and then but we didn't, so we didn't worry too much about it, but we kind of carried on with it. But I think it is important, as Rory pointed out. I think what's happening now with the PSD2, it further restricts the business. I mean, the ancillary wording within the directive is kind of worrying. And I think we just have to be conscious of the impact it might have to the business. And obviously what we want to all be doing is not worrying about losing 250 million, but worrying about where the next 250 million is going to come from. We need to grow the business, otherwise the FDs of the mobile operators will look at it and say, well, this isn't a big enough business to justify. So it's about growing the business, not worrying about it is worrying about safeguarding it, which is why we initially got an e-money license, but it's also about trying to grow the business as well.
Right stuff. Is that something you agree with, Rory?
Yeah, absolutely. Having worked for an M&O, I can safely say that when you go to your finance director and say, in the future, actually it's probably going to be a good idea to get a financial license to act as a payment provider, then, the sharp intake of breath is even worse than the plumbers. Because all the accounting processes have to change, because what they've established for telecoms accounting is completely different. How you hold prepay money is completely different. You have to be able to give back to a prepay user who's topped up by 15 quid, their 15 quid back. There's no mechanism to do that, so they have to develop that mechanism, split the billing functionality, and it is, the finance director is just saying pounds and euros and dollars and everything just in front of their eyes. O2 to change one price point for ITV, it cost them £50,000. So you can imagine what a change to a billing system would to encompass financial payments. And what they're not looking at, financial directors, because they're actually looking at spreadsheets. Sorry if anyone's a financial director of an M&O in the audience. They're looking at the spreadsheet. They're not looking 5 years forward and saying, actually, if we are a payment service provider, it's a phenomenal opportunity of actually opening up a really slick financial payment mechanism for anything. But we have to think about debt risk, credit, credit arrangements, e-money licensing, etc., etc., etc. They're not looking that far ahead, and you can write the spreadsheet that says this is what you'll make out of it, and they just go, no, we're worried about 2014 business plan. So that's the risk. Now, I could be getting a lot of the FDs wrong, and I think companies like O2, who've already got a banking license, may actually be behind the scenes going, there's some things we can do here, but they're a little bit isolated. The old Orange may also have a banking license. There may be some behind the scenes stuff. So I may be getting them wrong, but if I'm wrong, when I say it's quite a lot of people in the industry. If we're right and the M&Os will go, it's too expensive, then it wipes out a lot of investment that this market has put in place, potentially.
That's quite worrying.
Yeah, so which is why we're fighting for a continuation of the exemption, but actually a much clearer set of words that narrows it for European comfort, but keeps it open for future development of new breed of services.
Right, excellent. Which leads us nicely into our next session, which is about direct carrier billing. So, Rory and James, thank you very much.
Thank you.